University English Literature Department. And then in 1994, I transferred to a theatre department. And it made a big difference in how I read and studied and thought about Shakespeare. As long as I was teaching Shakespeare in an English department, I felt that my job really was to try and get the play right, to help students to understand what the play really meant and what Shakespeare really intended. But when I transferred to the theatre department, where the students were studying acting and directing and design, and I changed my view of Shakespeare, or at least of studying Shakespeare, to think rather not what it really means, but how we can make it mean something. And I've come much more to the view, as I will talk about in a bit, that there is no correct reading of a Shakespeare play. There is no correct way to produce the play on the stage. There are just different ways, some of them more interesting than others. I want to mention, first of all, two productions of Shakespeare plays, not Julius Caesar, but two productions which will introduce what I want to say about Julius Caesar. One, I don't know if you know, I have no idea what you know about things. There was a performance of Shakespeare's play Richard II, just one performance only, in the year 1601, when Shakespeare was still alive, was still writing, was still an actor. The performance was arranged to take place the night before an attempted rebellion by the Earl of Essex against the Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth, mustn't mix up my queens, because Richard II, the play, dramatizes the overthrow of a weak and ineffectual king and his replacement by a much more effective king, Henry IV. And to put on a production of this play in England right before an attempted rebellion was a very dangerous thing to do, and Shakespeare nearly got himself into trouble. His actors were actually interrogated by the authorities. What were you doing putting on a play? Because it seemed to encourage the idea of a rebellion against a monarch, against a king or queen in that case. The other production I want to mention is one that took place in, of all places, Baghdad in the year 1963. And I was actually in that play. I don't know if you know, Samir, but I spent a year in Iraq many years ago.
I didn't know about that.
I did. I was keeping it a secret, so this will be a surprise. I was very young, much too young, really. I was only about 21, and I was hired to teach English language in the College of Arts in the University of Baghdad in Al-Waziriyah. And in January 1963, the English faculty in that college decided to put on Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Macbeth, but I'll give you a very brief idea.
I think they studied the play last year, if I'm not
Okay, well, that's terrific. Well, you know that in Macbeth, we see a heroic soldier tempted to kill the king, Duncan, to set himself up as king, to become more and more of a despot, of a tyrant, a vicious and cruel man. And eventually he is overthrown by the king's son, Malcolm, and killed. Now, I don't know how many of you will remember who was president of Iraq in January 1963. And I can tell you, if I were to ask Canadian students who was the Canadian prime minister in January 1963, which is what, 60 years ago? None of them would remember. The president of Iraq in January 63 was Abdul Karim Qasim.
Yes.
Now, in 1958, Qasim had overthrown and killed the previous king, King Faisal, the last king of Iraq. And to put on a production of Macbeth in Baghdad in January 1963, showing a tyrant killing a king would have been very dangerous, I think. However, by April of 1963, Qasim had been overthrown by a coup led by the Ba'ath Party. And by April 1963, when the play was finally shown to an audience, it seemed instead like a celebration of the overthrow of Abdel Karim Qasim. So you can see what I mean. A play's meaning can change quite drastically depending when you put it on and where and who is watching. I'm going to talk a bit about what I call Shakespeare's power plays. That is to say, the plays that he wrote about historical figures, either English history or 4 plays actually about Roman history. And he's always interested in the struggle for power between historical figures, kings and queens and tyrants and assassins and so on. And the way in which Shakespeare's power plays have often been used to make new meanings for new societies or for different cultures about how power is exercised in a country. And I also want to remind us all that plays originally, Shakespeare's plays, were not written to be read, certainly not to be studied. I don't think Shakespeare would be happy to think that we all have to study Shakespeare's plays, which often leads to students disliking them. I don't know how you feel about that, but I know some students of mine at York University told me that they had to study Shakespeare in high school and learned to dislike him. The plays were written to be performed, to bring their characters to life on a stage. And when we read the plays ourselves, or when we even perform them, we can find and make our own meanings for them. We bring our own interests and values to bear on these plays. The play may have meant something very definite when Shakespeare wrote it, meant something for him, but we're all free to make it mean something else for ourselves. And so when I was teaching drama in the theatre department, I used to try and distinguish between what the play may have meant to the original audience 400 years ago and what we can make it mean for ourselves now. Now, of course, long before Shakespeare wrote his play, people knew all about Julius Caesar and had been writing about him and had been looking at his assassination in 44 BC in different ways. I don't know if you know the name Dante, an Italian poet who wrote a very famous, very long poem called the Divina Commedia, in which he is taken on a kind of guided tour of hell and purgatory and heaven. It doesn't matter whether you know it or not. He finished the poem in the year 1320, so nearly 300 years before Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar. And in his poem, Dante visits Brutus and Cassius in the lowest, darkest, and most awful part of hell. And why was this so? Why did Dante, when writing about Brutus and Cassius, put them in hell? And the reason apparently is that for Dante, the setting up of the Roman Empire was a necessary condition for the emergence of Christianity. So Julius Caesar was about to set up the Roman Empire, about to become emperor himself. And those two men who conspired to assassinate him were preventing God's plan, so Dante said, to create the Roman Empire. So for Dante, Brutus and Cassius were among the worst of all criminals, along in his poem with Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. So think what a different play Julius Caesar would have been if Shakespeare had shared Dante's point of view, how our sympathies would have been led in very different ways if Shakespeare had that notion that Brutus and Cassius were the worst of criminals. So Shakespeare takes a story that most people knew already. You know, of course, that Shakespeare almost never made up the stories of his own plays. Only 2 out of the 36 or 37 plays that he wrote have original stories. Mostly he took stories from history or from other literature, or from earlier plays. He rewrote earlier plays. So the audience knows what's going to happen, more or less, in a general way. The interest for the audience is, how is it going to be shown this time? How has Shakespeare chosen to dramatize these characters and these events? And usually in a Shakespeare play, it's not simple. In some plays it is. I don't know if you know the play Richard III, another English king, but Richard III is presented as a villainous, dastardly monster. He murders a lot of people in the course of the play and is killed at the end, and there is no pretense that he has human qualities that we should sympathize with. But in most of Shakespeare's plays, even the more or less villainous characters are shown in their complex humanity. We're invited to sympathize with them. Even Macbeth, even towards the end of Macbeth, when he is waiting to be attacked by the forces of Macduff, we see Macbeth making that famous speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day till the last syllable of recorded time. And we see Macbeth knowing that he's lost everything, that his killing of the King Duncan has eventually brought him no success or fame or pleasure, and that he's soon going to be killed. And the play invites us for that moment to feel sympathy, even for Macbeth. And this kind of human complexity is very central to what Shakespeare does. Shakespeare shows Julius Caesar, as I'm sure you will agree, as an unattractive character. Shakespeare doesn't really invite us to feel much sympathy for Julius Caesar himself. He could show Julius Caesar in a different way from the way that he is chosen to do. And it's always interesting when you're reading a Shakespeare play, or any play for that matter, to ask yourself, how might this play have been done differently? Because Shakespeare, when he wrote the play, was making choices. There's no right way to write a play about Julius Caesar. You have to choose how to show it, how to present it. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is ambitious, vain, domineering, proud, always speaks of himself in the third person. Caesar does this, Caesar does that, talks of himself as the North Star, the polar star, who is fixed in the heavens and around whom everybody else revolves. Cassius reports on Julius Caesar's weaknesses when they tried to swim across the Tiber together, or when Julius Caesar in Spain had a fever and did shake and call for water. And Cassius tries to say, this person was an ordinary, weak human being like the rest of us, and now this man has become a god. The play is called The Tragedy of Julius Caesar. When it was first published in 1623, that was the title that it had. Don't know really whether Shakespeare actually called it that, but it was printed as The Tragedy of Julius Caesar. But I don't think any of us reading the play feel that Caesar is a tragic character. I would think that the most important feature of a tragic character is that we are invited by the way in which he, or sometimes she, is shown, we're invited to feel sympathy for the suffering of a defeated person. If you think of King Lear and Macbeth and Hamlet, for that matter, especially, I suppose, we see the protagonist of a tragedy struggling with his situation and eventually defeated, often by his own weaknesses or shortcomings. And if it's a tragedy, we feel sympathy with his defeat. In fact, many people have said, and perhaps you've talked about this yourselves, that the play might be better called The Tragedy of Brutus, because Brutus is much more like a tragic character than Julius Caesar is. He takes up much more of the play. The play makes him the central character, and I think makes him something like a tragic figure. He's depicted very much in contrast to Caesar and to Cassius as high-minded, noble, with no personal ambition or hostility to Julius Caesar. He says, for myself, I have no reason to hate him. That he wants to claim that his motives for assassinating Caesar are for the public good, to save the Republic, to save the liberty of Romans, which will otherwise be lost under a tyranny. He says we must conduct this assassination in a noble and not violent way. He says to Cassius, we must be sacrificers, Cassius, and not butchers. We mustn't hack him to death. We must kill him as cleanly as we can. He's often described in the play as noble. Right at the end, we know Antony says of him after he's dead, through Antony's own action, this was the noblest Roman of them all. All of them, but only he, did what they did in envy of great Caesar. But Brutus assassinated Caesar for the good of the Republic. And the word noble is a very important one in Shakespeare's plays. The idea of nobility, what does it mean to be noble? Especially in the so-called Roman plays, which include not only Julius Caesar, but Antony and Cleopatra and Coriolanus. Or if you think of Hamlet, if you're aware of that at all, the beginning of the most famous speech in all of Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. Which is more noble, to bear your suffering bravely, or to kill yourself, essentially? And you'll find, if you read more of Shakespeare, you read Antony and Cleopatra, the idea of what does it mean to be noble is always coming up. And in Roman times, to be noble means something like to be courageous and generous and honorable, to have no personal motives, to have a feeling for the general good of society. To commit suicide when you have no other alternatives is a noble choice. Julius Caesar does not seem to be a very noble person, although Antony calls him noble, says the noblest man who lived in the tide of times. Cassius does not seem noble in the way that Brutus aspires to be. But perhaps this is part of Brutus's problem. He's too noble, if you like, for the dirty business of power politics, going back to calling this one of Shakespeare's power plays. The dirty realities, the practical realities of political power are not really consistent with being high-minded and noble. Cassius, we see 3 times in the play, is right when he gives Brutus practical and not particularly noble advice. Cassius says, we've got to kill Antony because Antony will be dangerous. Antony is one of Caesar's chief supporters and friends, and a dangerous person. If you don't kill Antony, he will come back to attack us. And Brutus says, no, we must be noble, Cassius. It would be savage. He said this were a savage spectacle if we were not behaving honorably. Then later in the play, when Antony says he wants to give a speech at Caesar's funeral, Cassius takes Brutus aside and says, don't do it. Don't let him do it. We don't know what he will say, and he has a great power to rouse up the crowd. And Brutus says, don't worry about that, Cassius. It's okay. I know what I'm doing. I will go first to make a speech, and I will tell the crowd that Antony is speaking with my permission, so nothing can go wrong. Now, in a tragedy, especially a Greek tragedy, but that's another matter, one of the great ironies of tragic drama is when anybody says nothing can go wrong. We know it in our own lives. If you're going swimming in the sea and somebody says you should wear a life jacket and you say, no, don't worry, I can swim, nothing can go wrong. You think, uh-oh, not a good idea. So we see a contrast between the practical and not particularly noble Cassius and the impractical and always striving to be noble Brutus. How is this performed on the stage or on film? Well, some of you, perhaps all of you, have seen the film from 1953, not, I think, a very fine production of the play, really, and it looks very old-fashioned in some of its acting styles, especially John Gielgud playing Cassius. He has that rather old-fashioned way of making his voice very resonant and proud. The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in ourselves, not in our stars, but in ourselves. However, the way that Brutus is portrayed by the well-known English actor James Mason adds to the impression of Brutus as a very sympathetic character. If you can picture him, he's always looking kind of agonized with worry and doubt and potential guilt. And the camera constantly focuses on Brutus's face, looking anguished. And his voice and his whole bearing, especially compared with Caesar, who is heavy and rather boorish looking, the production of the play in that film adds to the portrayal of Brutus as extremely sympathetic. And all you have to do is ask yourself what Brutus would look like played by a different actor. I mean, switch actors between Brutus and Julius Caesar. What a huge difference that would make. Now, nobody would do that. It wouldn't be appropriate, really. But it makes you see how much power there is in the director in simply casting the show, simply choosing the actors, because our impression of the character derives from, among other things, the way they look, the way they speak, the way on a film, the way the camera looks at them. I think it's always a good idea when you're studying Shakespeare, by the way, if you have the opportunity to do this, and also in teaching Shakespeare. Yes, it's a good idea to look perhaps at the whole film from the 1953 version, but something I used to try and do in the theatre department was take 2 or 3 or even 4 versions on video of the same scene. I used to do this with the play of King Lear. And I would take the opening scene of King Lear, where, if you know it at all, he asks his daughters to say how much they love him, and then gets absolutely furious when his daughter Cordelia says, "I love you according to my bond. I love you as is expected a daughter should love her father." But she refuses to flatter him, and he becomes furiously angry and throws her away from his court. If you look at 4 different versions of that scene, played by 4 different actors, different costumes, different settings, you can see 4 different ways of how that scene might have been done. And that allows us to think, of course, there is no correct way of doing it. There is only the way we have chosen to do it now. And the same is true of the writing. If a different playwright, in fact, different playwrights did do different versions of Julius Caesar. There was a contemporary of Shakespeare's called Daniel. I forget what his first name was now. Anyway, he wrote a play about Julius Caesar, and the plays are different. They show the story and the characters in different lights. And of course, it's rather like historical movies that are very popular nowadays. If we see a movie about historical events, the way that, have you ever seen the film about Gandhi, the great Indian leader? I mean, that film very actively makes Gandhi into a national hero, almost into a saint. And that was necessary, really, for the purposes of an Indian audience. Gandhi was a complicated figure and by no means a saint, but the way the film shows him idealizes him, shows an ideal portrait. So audiences in Shakespeare's time, just like audiences now, enjoy seeing historical figures brought to life, not always truthfully, but vividly. To see them on the stage, we don't need to be reminded that in Shakespeare's time, theatre was about the only form of public entertainment. No radio, no television, no films, very little indeed. Theatre was extremely popular in Shakespeare's time. And the theatres in London, there were only really 2 of them in Shakespeare's actual lifetime, could hold thousands of people. The play would often run for only perhaps 8 or 10 performances. Actors had to be extraordinarily good at remembering the lines of many different plays because they were constantly being renewed. But in the course of a week or more, possibly 15,000 people might see one of Shakespeare's plays. And that's quite a big crowd. The population of London at the time was only about 200,000, I think. So Shakespeare puts these characters, brings them to life, puts them on stage, and the way that he gives them lines to speak and actions to perform invites our sympathy and our judgment. And sometimes at the end of the play, I think we in the audience are almost invited to be something like a jury, as if we have been in a court and we have been shown all the evidence. And at the end of the play, you could almost see the playwright or the actors turning to the audience and saying, so what do you think? Guilty or not guilty? Is Macbeth guilty or not guilty? Well, guilty. I don't think there's much you can say about that. How about Othello? How about Hamlet? What on earth do we think about Hamlet by the end of that play? And if you haven't read it yet, you almost certainly will, I should think. So a play leads us by the way it shows us these characters behaving, and by the way in which the actors have performed them, leads us to sympathize and to judge. A colleague of mine in the York Theatre Department used to say, it is more important to be compelling than to be right, which is an interesting kind of motto for an actor or a director. By compelling, to hold the audience's attention, to make them think, to make them feel. If you're producing a play, like I said at the beginning, when I taught Shakespeare in an English department, I thought my job was to get it right. But my colleague would say it is more important to be compelling than to be right. And if you come out of seeing a Shakespeare play and you think, yes, I suppose that's probably the way Shakespeare would have done it, but it wasn't very interesting, that's really much worse than if you come out of the play saying, well, I don't know if Shakespeare would have approved of that, but it was tremendously powerful and interesting, compelling. And we might even ask ourselves, does it matter what Shakespeare really meant? Well, it does, of course. I mean, as students of literature, we want to know as much as we can about what Shakespeare may have thought about things, although it's hard to know. We know as much as we can about what language meant, what words meant in Shakespeare's time. But when we put the play on the stage, I don't think we should be trying to say to ourselves, let's put on this play so that if Shakespeare could come and see it, he would say to us, yes, exactly, that's what I meant. So the question is not, is it right and correct, but does it work? Is it interesting for an audience now? And of course, getting around to Julius Caesar and to the whole point of this talk, by the way, I don't know what the time is. Maybe I should, can you tell me what the time is, anybody? No, you can't, but I can because I've got my...
Still we have 25 minutes.
Okay, good, that's fine. Thank you, Samir. Okay, so Julius Caesar has been used by a lot of people to be a kind of illustration of situations in different political periods and different cultures. So if you do a production of Julius Caesar in which you make Caesar look like Napoleon in France in 1800, when after the revolution which overthrew the king, Louis XVI, only 10 years later, Napoleon installs himself as emperor. I don't know if anybody in France did, in fact, write or do a production of Julius Caesar, suggesting, probably not, showing that Julius Caesar was actually rather like Napoleon. That would have been a dangerous thing to do, I should think. Or if you do a production in Italy in 1922, in which you make Julius Caesar look like Mussolini, Do we know who Mussolini is? The leader of the fascists in Italy, who sort of who preceded Hitler in coming to power in Germany. It's a very popular interpretation of Julius Caesar to dress the play up in the military uniforms and costumes of Italy in 1922 and have Caesar played like Mussolini, wearing a certain helmet and, seizing power. Or I ask, rather tentatively, would it be possible to do a production of Julius Caesar in Iraq in which Julius Caesar was recognizably looking like Saddam Hussein? If you gave him Saddam Hussein's uniform, or that popular picture of Saddam wearing a hat and holding an umbrella, if you put on a production of this play with Julius Caesar looking recognizably to the audience, you don't change the language, you just do the play, you do every the words that Shakespeare wrote, but you make Caesar look like Saddam Hussein, would that work? Or would the audience think, no, it's ridiculous, it's not credible. It's not an accurate or just or reasonable comparison. I don't know, of course. And then also, sorry, somebody was going to say? All right, I'll go on. Of course, we finally get around to the point. For modern audiences in America today, it's very tempting to make Julius Caesar look like Donald Trump. And it has been done. And I will say a few things in a minute or two about the production of Julius Caesar in 2017 in Central Park in New York, where Caesar was perfectly recognizably portrayed as Donald Trump. What did the play mean in that situation? And what were the consequences of doing it? And the consequences were quite serious, actually. Turn my paper over here. That's right, excuse me. There is a book I would mention to you, and I can send Samir or Noor the details of it. It's called Shakespeare in a Divided America, and it's by a man named James Shapiro, who has written 3 or 4 books about Shakespeare, actually. But this one, Shakespeare in a Divided America, tells about some of the productions of Shakespeare's plays which have been controversial and topical in American history, and ends up discussing the production of Julius Caesar in Central Park in 2017. First of all, not first of all, but one of the things he talks about is the use of the idea of the play of Julius Caesar surrounding the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Again, I don't know how familiar you would be with American history, but Lincoln, you may know, became president in 1861, and in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, was assassinated in a theater. He was actually there in the audience of a theater. And the man who assassinated him was an actor named John Wilkes Booth. And that man, that actor, had played in productions of Julius Caesar and regarded himself as Brutus. Now, if you know anything about Abraham Lincoln, the great hero of American politics, the man who freed the slaves, it would seem very strange to regard Lincoln as something like Julius Caesar. It would seem outrageous to most Americans nowadays. But in 1864-65, after the very brutal Civil War in which hundreds of thousands of Americans had been killed, the supporters of the Southern cause, the Southern armies, all those states in the south of the United States which attempted to break away from the Union and set themselves up as the Confederacy, they regarded Abraham Lincoln as a tyrant, a despot, as someone who wanted to make himself a king of America. And of course, the United States was founded only 70 years earlier by getting rid of their subservience to the English king. So for the members of the Southern United States of the Confederacy, Lincoln looked like a king, or someone who wanted to be king, and therefore it would be right and just to assassinate him. Now, they never in fact put on a play showing Lincoln to look like Julius Caesar. You couldn't have done it in Washington or New York. You couldn't have done it in the northern part of the United States. But it's interesting and true that the man who killed Lincoln identified very strongly with Brutus. And of course, like Brutus, he was unsuccessful. He killed Lincoln, yes, but he didn't manage to escape. He was tracked down and killed only 10 days later. In the South of the United States, he was for some time regarded as a hero. And with a rather bitter irony for him, in the North, Lincoln was eventually identified rather with King Duncan in Macbeth. If you know the lines in Macbeth, besides this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office. And the speech goes on to say that Duncan was a noble and almost saintly person. So there was an actor thinking of himself as Brutus, trying to kill Lincoln, regarded as Julius Caesar. But eventually Lincoln was remembered instead as the saintly murdered King Duncan. Another famous... Sorry.
Sorry, sir. How are you, sir?
I'm okay. Are we all right? We doing okay? Is everything all right, Samir? Can people hear me? We're going okay?
Yes, go ahead, Robert. Continue.
Carry on.
Okay, I'm nearly coming to the end, so don't worry if you can't stay much longer.
No, it's okay, as long as you want.
But I know it's difficult for people, especially for you students, and I do thank you for being here and being interested enough to listen to what I have to say. I hope it means something. But I know it's difficult just listening to a person talking for a long time. There was a famous production of Julius Caesar in the United States in 1937, produced and directed by the famous actor Orson Welles. I don't know if you know who Orson Welles was. He most famous for making the film Citizen Kane. He was a prodigy. He was very famous and successful very young. I mean, he was famous by the time he was about 20. And he did a production in 1937 of Julius Caesar in which he cast himself as Brutus. So he not only produced the play and directed the play, but starred in the play, which you might say would seem to be ambitious. And his play was quite frankly and obviously anti-fascist. Because by 1937, of course, not only Mussolini, but by that time Hitler was in power, and the danger of another war led by the fascists in Europe, and also for that matter, General Franco in Spain, seemed very severe. And Orson Welles' production of the play was quite obviously and uncomplicatedly an attack on fascism. The actor playing Julius Caesar was made to look rather like Mussolini rather than Hitler. It would have been almost absurd, I think, to show Julius Caesar as Hitler with the little moustache and everything, but with Mussolini, it looks quite realistic. However, it's interesting to know that Orson Welles did not sympathize with Brutus and the other conspirators. Of course, however you perform the play Julius Caesar, you cannot change the story. It's going to work out badly for Brutus and Cassius. They're going to make tactical errors or strategic errors, however you like to say it. They allow Antony to seize power. Antony's marvelous, compelling speech to the crowd in Rome at Caesar's funeral, which incidentally, Shakespeare invented. A lot of what happens in Shakespeare's plays, he is taking from the sources, from the original history or story that he's now dramatizing. But sometimes he makes things up, totally invents them. And they are sometimes the most interesting part of the play, because if he's only reproducing the material from the source, if he hasn't changed it very much, then we don't know really what Shakespeare was, what his imagination was coming up with. He was simply reproducing the original. But that great speech of Antony's, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar. Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious, and so it were a grievous fault in him, and grievously hath Caesar paid for it. And so it goes on, and Antony keeps saying, and Brutus is an honorable man. And at first he says it fairly simply, Brutus is an honorable man, but by the end of it he's saying, and Brutus is an honorable man. And by the end of it, he's roused the crowd up to an absolute fury. From Orson Welles' point of view, Brutus, particularly as the leader of the assassins, the leader of the conspirators, is not a heroic figure to be admired and emulated. He represents the failure of naive liberal idealists to really understand what fascism means and how it must be opposed. And I think Orson Welles would probably have said pretty simply, if you're going to try to overthrow a Caesar, if you're going to try and assassinate a Mussolini or a Hitler, you've got to do it properly. You have got to be ruthless. If you're attacking a ruthless enemy, you must be ruthless too. So from what I've understood, what I've learned about it, Orson Welles' production of Julius Caesar did not make Brutus out to be some kind of tragic, noble failure, but rather a weak and ineffectual, a man out of his depth, a man who doesn't really know how to handle the power which he is trying to take on. So in a way, he deserved to fail. And if Brutus deserved to fail, then the only people who would deserve to succeed would be those who would know how to take the power that they have tried to take away from Caesar. Anyway, there was also, finally, this is where I will come to an end, there was a production of Julius Caesar in Central Park in 2017, by which time Donald Trump was already president and was already showing the kind of president that he would be. I don't know how much you are aware of what Donald Trump's presidency has been like for Americans. I am Canadian now, grew up in England, but have lived in Canada for a very long time. So he's not my president, he's their president, which we're always glad to know. But our television screens have been filled with Donald Trump for 4 years and still are, because he hasn't gone away. Yes, he lost the election, although he doesn't agree that he did. And I don't know if you saw the events of January the 6th of this year, just 2 months ago this day, I think, isn't it? When Trump roused up a crowd to attack the Capitol, a mob, very much like the Roman mob, rather like the Roman mob in the film of Julius Caesar. When you remember after Antony's speech, they smash all the stalls in the market square and start burning them and charge off to find Brutus and Cassius to try and kill them, rather than the way that Trump roused a crowd to go to the Capitol, chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." Fortunately, those people didn't appear to have guns with them. If they had, it could have been an absolute massacre. So, as I say, I don't know how large Donald Trump looms in your imagination, whether he fills your television screens the way he still fills ours. But it's irresistible for theater people to see Caesar as Donald Trump and to put on a play in which the audience is invited to watch the assassination of Trump. In other words, to fulfill a kind of fantasy which many, many people have had of how to get rid of Trump, how to assassinate him. I don't say that there have been plots to assassinate him. I don't know that there have. I really do not think there have been. America is not yet that kind of country. But I do know that many people, just in conversation, sitting over dinner, would say to each other, if you were going to assassinate Donald Trump, how would you do it? Especially, how would you do it and try and get away with it? I've even thought of this myself. I thought maybe you could set up a television camera with a high-powered rifle inside the camera somehow. So anyway, what I'm saying is that the play gave audiences the opportunity to see the fulfillment of the fantasy of someone looking very much like Donald Trump being stabbed to death by people in modern dress. It wasn't all dressed up in Roman costumes. Oh no, it was, Trump was wearing a suit with a big red tie. He had sort of blonde yellow hair, just like Trump does. So there was no concealing what was happening. But then what happened, and this is the most interesting thing. Again, I get this from that book I mentioned to you, Shakespeare in a Divided America. This is not coming from my knowledge, I got it from a book. Instead of cheering or being excited and thrilled by the prospect of Trump being assassinated, especially in a very bloody and violent way, the audience was completely silent. The audience was absolutely shocked to see what, in a sense, they had wished for coming to pass, coming true. And then what happened? One by one, some people in the audience, eventually quite a number of people in the audience, stood up and started protesting against the spectacle of assassinating Donald Trump. And then what happened? It became apparent that those people were not, in fact, Trump supporters. They were actors. The director of the play had put people in the audience who, at the right moment, stood up and started saying, shame, shame, how could you do this? This is disgusting. This should not be allowed. And so the audience was suddenly put in a very complex situation. You've seen, in a way, what you want, the assassination of the president, but you've also been made to see it as an extremely brutal action. Is this really what you want? Would you feel satisfied if this actually happened? And then people in the audience, initially pretend to protest against it. And of course, as the play goes on, Brutus and Cassius have to flee from Rome and are eventually defeated at the Battle of Philippi and killed. And in a way, what the director of the play seemed to want to show was that however much you may hate Trump, and believe me, in America nowadays, you either love Donald Trump or you hate Donald Trump. As that book says, Shakespeare in a Divided Country, Americans are extremely divided between adoring the man and wishing he would come back as president and hating him. But the play seemed to say, however much you may hate this monstrous person who is the president, you cannot save democracy. You cannot save the republic by undemocratic means. Look what happened when they tried to assassinate Caesar. It all went wrong, and Caesar eventually triumphed anyway. He is dead, but the idea of what you might call Caesarism was successful, and the empire was finally established, and Octavius becomes the Emperor Augustus. The Republic is gone forever. The Republic was never very democratic in ancient Rome, but it was sort of democratic, and there was certainly no king, no emperor. So the outcome of the attempt to assassinate Caesar is to establish the empire forever, for hundreds of years. I'm interested to wonder what would happen, what will happen perhaps, if Trump tries to become president again in 2024, and if another theater company tried to put on a play showing Julius Caesar as somebody trying to set himself up as a tyrant. And one last thing, in New York, you have to understand that the audience for Shakespeare's plays is almost entirely what we would call liberals. That is people who hate Trump anyway. Very few people in America, very few people other than sort of educated liberal people from New York and, you know, Boston and California, very few people would go and see Shakespeare who are also Trump supporters. It's just not the same kind of person. If you were to take that production of Julius Caesar and show it in one of the so-called red states, the states where Trump is very popular and very supported, if you took that play to Jefferson, Mississippi, and performed it there, I doubt if you would be able to finish the show before the audience came up on stage and started attacking the actors. And in fact, even that production in New York, the actors received death threats. The director received death threats to him and his family. I mean, this is a big thing in the States now, where anybody that the Trump supporters don't like get emails and text messages and letters saying, we know where you live, we know where your children live, we are going to kill you. And the people who put that production of Shakespeare on in the park got death threats, which tells us one thing, at least, that Shakespeare is still extremely relevant to our time and to the politics of our culture. I would love to know from you, if it's possible, how Julius Caesar would be received in Iraq, whether, as I suggested, if you dressed Caesar up as Saddam Hussein, would that just be nonsense? It's, you know, I mean, you may all be thinking to yourself, that's really a silly idea. Or you may be thinking to yourself, yes, it was done in Baghdad well, you couldn't have done it while Saddam was still alive, could you, I think? No, you really could not. You'd be crazy. Would there make any point in doing it since? I just don't know. And also the idea of how suppose you in this class studying Shakespeare with Dr. Noor were to think about putting on a production of Julius Caesar. I know you can't probably under the pandemic. And anyway, it's a very difficult job putting a Shakespeare play on. So many characters and so much work involved in putting it on a stage. But if you were thinking as a class, what would we do to make Julius Caesar a compelling, perhaps not right, maybe not one that Shakespeare would come along and think, oh, thank you, you've understood what I meant, you've done it the way I wanted it. But if you wanted to do a compelling production of Julius Caesar, what might you try and do? I'm going to stop there. And if there is a way in which we could have a conversation in which I could take questions, I would very much look forward to doing so. Perhaps we should have a few minutes, just, 4 or 5 minutes break to walk around. I shall have a quick drink of water, and then we'll